The space race was a major turning point that greatly affected the lives of American people. It opened up a new frontier, introducing the possibility of much technological development.
The event that set the space race in motion was the launching of Sputnik. Sputnik was the world's first satellite. The unmanned vessel was launched on October 4, 1957 by the Soviet Union. Before Sputnik was launched, America wasn't focusing on space travel at all. However, they had assumed that they would eventually be first into space. Sputnik was a reality check for America. It forced us to realize that the Soviet Union was actually far ahead of our country in technology, math, and science.
Launching of Sputnik was bad news for America, not only because we wouldn't have the first satellite in space, but also because the Soviet Union was America's #1 enemy. There was great fear among Americans that the Russians would bomb the United States from space.
In fact, this was such bad news that President Eisenhower and several others held a conference shortly after the launching to discuss what to do next. Americans began to realize that their school systems were not as advanced as the Soviet Union's in terms of science and engineering. More pressure was put on American students to accomplish more in school.
I was 8 years old when Sputnik went into space, so I only vaguely remember it. But I do remember that I wasn't very happy with the Russians, because everyone was so worried about them beating us in the space race that even in the 3rd grade we were suddenly bombarded with science homework.
In fact, Sputnik was such a huge crisis in America that the U.S. government created a new agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, also known as NASA, to compete in this technological battle. NASA had 8,000 employees and a budget of $100 million a year.
After Sputnik returned to Earth, the space race began in earnest. The Americans and the Soviets were both determined to put the first man in space. Again, the Soviets beat the Americans. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to leave Earth's orbit.
Gagarin returned safely to Earth. Shortly after his return, President John F. Kennedy announced a goal to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. The moon became the finish line of the space race. Whoever got there first, the Americans or the Russians, would be the winners.
Over the next few years, both the Soviet Union and America accomplished many space-related feats. The Americans put another man, Alan Shepard, into space a few months after Gagarin, and the Soviet Union was able to send the first woman to space. The Soviets also conducted the first spacewalk, in which a cosmonaut left the spacecraft for 12 minutes, with only a tether keeping him from floating away.
It seemed to many that the Soviets still had a lead in the space race, but America worked hard to attempt to meet Kennedy's goal. They also had the advantage of funds that the Soviets could not match. Americans started to close the gap between themselves and the Soviets.
Both sides suffered many tragedies throughout the space race. The most famous was the Americans' Apollo 1 disaster.
Apollo 1's mission was to test launching and control operations. However, disaster struck before it could accomplish its goal. During a test, Apollo 1 caught on fire. All 3 of the people inside died within 17 seconds.
One of the worst things about this disaster was that it could have easily been prevented. There are many problems with the spacecraft which could have been fixed. NASA learned from the mistakes they made, but the space program was stopped for a year.
The United States recovered fairly quickly from the Apollo 1 disaster. With a greater number of successful launches than the Soviets, it was becoming clear that the U.S. was getting a huge lead in the space race. It looked nearly impossible for the Soviets to catch up.
One reason the public perceived that the United States had a major lead in the space race was because of publicity. The Soviets were very secretive. They often didn't announce a space mission until they knew it would be successful. It wasn't until the race was over that people outside the Soviet Union knew of their failures.
On the other hand, America always announced their space missions and showed off their astronauts. Because they knew more about what was happening on America's side of the space race, people generally supported the United States.
On July 20th, 1969, America's hard work finally paid off. Apollo 11 made it to the moon, and Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon, famously saying, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." People across the country and around the world were glued to their television sets, knowing that they were watching history.
I was very young when Apollo 11 was launched. All I remember is that it was a historical event and that every magazine, newspaper, television captured the success. Neil Armstrong became very famous after the launch, and he was in the headlines of all the articles.
Armstrong, along with 2 other astronauts, Edwin Aldrin and Michael Collins, returned to Earth safely and were declared American heroes. The race to the moon was over. The Americans had beaten the Soviets in the space race.
In the years after the Americans beat the Soviets to the moon, our interest in space travel decreased. Space exploration was expensive and dangerous. Also, once the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union was no longer America's #1 enemy, so it was unnecessary to continue racing them.
However, the space race is still one of the greatest turning points in American history, first because space travel unlocked a whole new universe that had never been explored before. Humans were no longer confined to one planet.
But the space program had implications far beyond interplanetary travel. Starting in the 1960s, American culture, entertainment, and design took on a completely new look. Architects started designing space-age buildings. Television writers produced futuristic programs such as The Jetsons and Lost in Space.
Most importantly, if we hadn't gone into space, much of the technology that we rely on today would be non-existent. Many devices rely on satellites to function. Satellites, which in this case are man-made objects that orbit around the Earth, have been used for many reasons since the launching of Sputnik. Cell phones, GPSs, and many other devices depend on satellite use. Without them, our lives would be very different.
Without the space race, America would not be the country it is today. Even decades after it occurred, it still affects our way of life in ways that, before the space race, nobody had dreamed of.